one of the headlines I read in the Los Angeles Times, momentum shifts in Ukraine war as Russia advances in the Donbass. Can you give some insight into what they're talking about?
Yeah, so over the last couple of weeks, Russia has modified its tactics and concentrated its efforts on a very small part of the Donbass, particularly a city called Severodonetsk and a couple cities around it, and have made some gains. And in particular, as of a couple of days ago, it looked like they were going to take Severodonetsk, which is an important strategic town within that region. Although the reports this morning are they maybe are stalled now and maybe the Ukrainians have taken a little bit back. But clearly the Russians have made gains. That's the significant point. When the LA Times uses the word momentum, I would be a little bit careful. They are making gains, but momentum implies a sort of self perpetuating gains, and that is not the case. It's quite the opposite, which is every little bit they're gaining very slowly and at high cost.
Is this a major shift in strategy? So the initial strategy was take over Kiev, install puppet government really quickly. Now, is the strategy essentially take over this region, declare victory, and end the war?
That we do not know. And so, sometimes we use the words strategy and tactics a little bit sloppily. Maybe I would be better off saying they've changed their tactics than their strategy. We still don't know very much at all about what Putin's goals are, either in the sense of what's the ideal world, right? If he could get all the territory he could take, where would he stop? We don't know that. Nor do we know sort of what could he live with, right? If he had to. But in terms of tactics, the early, I think of this as two different parts of World War II. The early part of the tactics was trying to attack on a lot of fronts with armor, right? The idea you punch through quickly, you surround things, and you cut them off, and you win very quickly that way. That really didn't work, of course. What they're doing now is more the parts of World War II. I always think about the sort of the siege of Berlin or the siege of Warsaw, where they basically just lined up tons and tons of artillery, and they would aim at a fairly small area, blast it into rubble till it really couldn't be defended, move in some people, aim a little bit further, blast it into rubble, and so move very slowly that way. This is how they finally took Grozny when they restarted the Chechen War after 1999. And it basically meant that in order to take the city, you had to annihilate it. And that's what's happening in Severodonetsk, which is a much smaller city. These tactics are working because while Russia does not have a lot of manpower, they have a ton of artillery, and they have all the shells they need. And when I say artillery, I'm also including things like multiple rocket launcher systems, mortars. So that's what it's been. It's not a fast-moving thing. It's not a thing where you get momentum. It's a slow, grinding way of doing things. But inexorably, if you continue to maintain your superiority in artillery, you can inexorably, grindingly move forward. And that's what they're doing right now.
Seems like a scorched earth strategy. Is that appropriate thing to say?
Yeah, I mean, we usually talk about scorched earth, in particular when people are retreating, that they burn everything behind them. But it's a scorched earth strategy in the sense of you saying we're not trying to take these cities intact. We don't want to govern these cities. We don't want to govern the populations. We're happy simply to drive the people out. It's really about the territory. And I think they're doing something. I have to point out where I predicted things correctly because it doesn't happen very often. I talked a long time ago about the idea of, especially with cities, that they would do the Grozny thing, which is to depopulate them. Because if you don't depopulate them, then you deal with insurgents. And so they're essentially, even in these small cities, they do this in Mariupol, just bombard it until everybody leaves. And then they're going to, at some point down the road, if they can keep the terror, sometime this year, next year after that, they'll really repopulate it with people they move in from Russia.
Mm-hmm. I just want to, there's actually a phrase in this article I just want to read. For Ukraine, The war has taken a dark, edgy turn in the Donbass, the vast swath of farm towns, coal pits, and smokestack cities that forms much of the country's eastern border with Russia. Divided since 2014 between Ukraine and pro-Russia separatists, the Donbass, home to more than 4 million before Moscow's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th. appears in danger of falling completely to Moscow. 4 million is not a small amount of people. So is the strategic, the goal is to drive all of those people out and take over that territory and hold it.
Yeah, and I don't want to exaggerate. They're not going to try to drive every single person out, but certainly anybody who might fight them, right? This is not a hearts and minds strategy. This is, if you're against us, we're either going to kill you or we're going to force you out. We're not going to win you over.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We're not going to govern the population as it is. Anybody who's against us, we just want to drive out so we don't have to deal with it. It is a big chunk of land. This, before 2014, this was one of the most densely populated parts of Ukraine. And of course, a lot of people left after the war that was started in 2014, which, by the way, people always talk about Russian separatists. Those Russian separatists were basically on the verge of being defeated until the Russian army invaded in 2014. I think it's always important to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
The separatists were separatists, but they were easily dealt with until the Russian army invaded. So this was a Russian invasion from the beginning back in 2014. Let's not kid ourselves.
Mm-hmm. That being said, with this happening in Donbass, Washington said this week that it's sending M142 high mobility artillery rocket systems to Ukraine. It'll more than double its army's artillery range and allow it to strike targets 50 miles away. In response, Dmitry Medvedev, the former prime minister under Putin, he warned that Moscow could target Western cities if Ukraine uses rocket systems supplied by the United States to carry out strikes on Russian territory. Specifically, he said, if God forbid these weapons are used against Russian territory, then our armed forces will have no other choice but to strike decision-making centers. So this seems highly risky for the United States to send these weapon systems to Ukraine, because there is potential, even though Biden's saying these aren't going to be used in Russian territory. We don't know that, right? Is it highly risky?
I don't think we can deter ourselves. Right now, Putin is winning this game because he has us negotiating with ourselves over what we're willing to do. And we're letting him win this game. I don't want to see a nuclear war, and I certainly don't want to see Russia attacking Western cities, because that probably means a nuclear war. But this is a game, of course, right? They see that if you read Western newspapers, there's all these people wringing their hands about, Putin could escalate, Putin could escalate. So their whole goal, right, is to get us to not supply the Ukrainians. And the way they do that is by playing on our own fears of escalation. And so the situation, it's a very tricky situation now, which is the United States and the West are trying to help Ukraine win, but not too much. Because we've convinced ourselves that we've got to be afraid of Russian escalation. And I think it's my opinion now, and I think I'm probably not in the sort of the smack in the middle of the mainstream on this. We got to get this sorted out in our heads. Are we going to try to bring the risks for us down to zero, in which case, absolutely throw the Ukrainians under the bus and put out the welcome mat for the Russians? Or are you going to say not stopping Russia is risky, and so stopping Russia is worth taking some risk as well, which is what I would say. The people, and there's an increasing debate in the West, a lot of people basically raising this question. We have to make sure not to humiliate Russia, is what Macron, the president of France, said. We have to make sure we let Putin save face. I've said this. And I think in a way this is true. But you have to think about, if you're trying to win a war, you have to try to win a war. And the situation where the United States and Ukraine are limiting themselves without ever actually challenging Russia is not a very productive way to fight this war. Mm-hmm. And we definitely don't want to do anything that unreasonably raises the chance of Putin using nuclear weapons. Or, is Putin really going to attack New York and Washington? Right? Because what happens then?
Yeah, exactly. What happens then? It seems it would be pretty catastrophic for them.
Exactly. So that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's not going to happen. But you also have to leave some of the risk on the Russians. Because if you reduce the risk to zero, what reason do they have not to just keep on going?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. It seems that what you're saying is that we can't have this like our foot partially in the door type of strategy. We have to essentially make a moral decision on what's appropriate and then go all in on that decision.
And you have to accept that yes, is there a risk that Putin will escalate? Yes. There's also a risk of us sending the message that we're so afraid of Putin escalating that we'll give him whatever he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay, he gets Donbass. He clearly doesn't want only Donbass because he's already taken huge chunks of southern Ukraine. He's already attacked Kiev. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So to act as though all he really wants is Donbass, I just think is, what's the word? It's delusional. So where do you want to stop him? And at some point, right, is there a bigger risk from stopping him or from not stopping him?
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't heard that conversation.
Yeah. And your other point is this is maybe just bluster coming out of, Russian heads of state, their leadership. It's a form of a psychological warfare, essentially, right?
Of course.
Which is they're good at it.
Well, they're good at it, and we're susceptible to it because there are so many people in the West who, frankly, don't want to be involved to begin with, right? If you take all the people who would have thrown Ukraine under the bus 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it basically, Putin is giving them the ammunition to help Putin.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's working.
Yeah, and so just on that point, I mean, there are growing questions in the United States and Western Europe whether helping Ukraine is a viable strategy in the long term, right? Yep. So other than, this risk that Putin poses, so that's one reason to help Ukraine. Can you give us some other reasons why we should really be all in, like you said, or be supporting?
I think there is a really good question for the West, and I think the West is deeply confused right now about its strategy. And so this is where I would agree with the critics, which is, we have this strategy that's sort of contradictory, again, in that we want to help Ukraine, but not too much. And so we're trying to modulate how much do we want to help Ukraine win, whatever that means, to stop the Russians, maybe get some territory back, maybe get even more territory back, against this risk that we have no way of assessing that Russia would sometime escalate.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I might want to come back to that risk of escalation. So what we don't have is a strategy, which is to say we don't have a sense of here's a goal and here's a way to bring about the goal. Because every time we think about bringing about the goal, right, we put the brakes on ourselves because we're afraid of escalation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is that what's happening, though? Because the United States is providing weapons and, they've increased the I think it's $40 billion was the latest number. Yeah. So is it possible that the Biden administration does have a strategy, but maybe the general population of the United States doesn't even understand it?
No.
No.
I would like to think there is a strategy, but it's, the old military saying is hope is not a strategy. I think the strategy is that if we keep supporting Ukraine, the Russian war effort will collapse. The Russians will defeat themselves. That would be great, right? Maybe they'll just get tired and go home, I think is the idea. I think that's wishful thinking. I think Putin, he has not brought in, he's not had to go to a draft or general conscription. At the level this war is being fought, it's possible, it's not definite, it's possible they can hang on for a long time. Now, maybe they're going to run out of soldiers, right? Both Ukraine and Russia have been taking pretty heavy casualties in the Donbass. So, right. But at that point, are they going to go home? No, they're going to dig in. And so we have this sense that in order to get where we need to be, Ukraine has to take back some of that territory. But that's also what we've decided we're afraid of. And so, which, ultimately, it's typical of the United States, which is, we want to have sort of a risk-free strategy. And
that's not how the real world works.
That's not how the real world works, especially when you're dealing with somebody like Putin, who, if you want a risk-free strategy, he'll give you the risk-free strategy. The risk-free strategy is to give him everything he wants.
Mm-hmm. But you're saying so what you said earlier. Actually, I thought that was the United States' strategy is just to supply money and weapons until Russia eventually gets tired. You're saying that's not an appropriate strategy, though. You're saying that.
I'm saying it's a strategy that could succeed, but we at least, if that's the strategy, and we see some signs that this is happening, but if that's the strategy, we have to be girding to do this for 5 or 10 years. Right?
If you were advising this administration, what would you say would be the appropriate strategy?
I think there's two things that I would do. One is I would start talking about months and years, so that the American people get used to the idea, but so the Ukrainians get used to the idea, and above all, so that the Russians get used to the idea. I mean, look at the way we cut and ran from Afghanistan. The Russians have very good reason to believe that we will not hang in there. And so we need to do some work to convince them that we will. Mm-hmm. And same thing with our allies, by the way. And that we need to convince our allies that we'll stick around, and we need to push them to make a commitment to sticking around. So that's the first thing, is we're willing and we're going to ramp up our defense production so that we can keep supplying the Ukrainians for as long as the Ukrainians want to fight. That would be number one. And number two is we need to, I think, sort of change our rhetoric. Putin is making all these threats, and there is no cost to him for making these threats, right? Because when he says, I'm going to bomb Washington, instead of saying, well, if you bomb Washington, say goodbye to Moscow, we've said, oh, please don't, right? So they're trying to modulate our risk. We need to modulate their risk as well. And that's a tougher thing to do because the French and the Germans kind of freak out when we talk about that sort of stuff. But again, it's time for them to decide. Mm-hmm. Right? Are they going to stand up or are they not? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I realize I sound like a warmonger, and I don't mean to be a warmonger. And I want to be clear. I don't want to be a warmonger, but I think the things that we are doing is making more conflict likely rather than making it less likely. Mm-hmm. Right, and that's why we get into this argument about realism. And we're in this very strange world where the realists are counseling surrender. And people like me who don't necessarily think of themselves as realists are saying, no, this is one of those times where you really do have to stand up and fight because that's the only way this is going to stop.
Let me talk to your first point about you said like giving a timeline and sending a message to the people that this is what it's going to take. I cannot imagine that'll be politically advantageous to any U.S. administration, mainly due to the fact of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? I mean, the people are tired. Putin probably knows this as well. So politically, can something like that even be stated? And will the people even back something like that?
Let me play the other side of that. So let's say the answer is no, right? Then we better find an exit strategy fast. Mm-hmm. And this is where the people who I disagree with actually have a point, which is that the end result of this is we throw the Ukrainians under the bus. Might be better to throw them under the bus sooner rather than later. There is another perspective that says no. Even if you're going to throw them under the bus, the higher a cost you impose on Russia, the safer the rest of Europe will be in the future because it'll be less likely they'll do this again. So that. Better to throw them under the bus after 5 years than after 5 months. Mm-hmm. That's cynical in the respect that it basically turns the Ukrainians into cannon fodder, basically saying, help us raise the cost for Russia, not to protect Ukraine, but to protect the West of Europe. But that's a viable strategy if a cynical one. Mm-hmm. This is one of the problems with American strategy in general. And we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan, we saw it in Vietnam, right? Is we go into these things with this idea that if we just do the right thing, things will turn out easy peasy. And that depends a lot on who you're fighting. And one of the things I think, Sirish, that you and I talked about way back at the beginning, right, was that the Russians weren't going away anytime soon. They were not going to collapse. I seem to think, again, one of the few things I've gotten right about this is it seems to me that on our first or second conversation way back in February or March, I was talking about months or years.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as though the people in the White House and the Pentagon couldn't figure this out. If I could figure it out, and you could figure it out. And so I actually don't think that's the problem, in the sense that, to go back to your original point, this is still like the only thing that Republicans and Democrats agree on in this country, at least inside the Beltway. Mm-hmm. The so-called, there's a term for this, right? There's a derogatory term, but basically what you would call the foreign policy elite. One thing they agree on is that we've got to support Ukraine against Russia. Mm-hmm. The blob, that's what it's called.
The blob, okay. I don't
disagree with it. Call it the blob. So in that sense, I don't think Biden is really disadvantaged politically because there are very few Republicans who are going to come out and say something different. And the ones who do are going to look unpatriotic. Mm-hmm. And they're going to look like they're pro-Russian. Rand Paul's not getting great press for being, supporting Putin. Mm-hmm. I don't think. Mm-hmm.
One of the things you said is you don't foresee some sort of collapse happening to Russia. I just want to bring up a certain another line from this article. Zelensky said Thursday that more than 30,000 Russian servicemen have died, and that's actually more than the Soviet Union lost in 10 years of the war in Afghanistan. If that is the case, who knows if that number is accurate or not? But you're saying that there's no scenario in the short term where things change for Russia.
Well, no, I think there is. So let's just take for Zelensky's figure for granted for the moment, and we shouldn't, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that's an inflated number. But if you were to include not people killed, but people killed and injured, no longer able to fight, 30,000 overall casualties might be a reasonable number. I really don't know. Mm-hmm. But whatever that number is, they started this war with about 250,000. So whether it's 15,000 or 25,000 or 30,000, it's a big chunk of that force. And of course, it's not the supply clerks. It's the people who do the fighting that have been killed. So in that respect, the Russian capacity to fight a certain kind of warfare is being degraded. That doesn't get them out of Ukraine. It just makes it harder for them to advance. And this is where I want to make the point where I think when we talk about nuclear escalation, we're having the wrong conversation, which is, and let me just play inquiry for a minute. So you're Putin. You're sitting in Moscow. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that because the troops are degraded and because the Americans sent a whole bunch of artillery over, Russia starts losing territory in either Donbass or southern Ukraine or both. What would you do? Would you nuke somebody?
I don't think so.
Well, maybe you would and maybe you wouldn't.
Yeah.
We're all glad, by the way.
Yeah.
We all wish, rather, that we were fighting this war against you rather than Putin.
Yeah.
Much nicer and more reasonable.
Yeah.
The point that I'm getting at is, long before Putin gets around to nuking something, right, there's a lot of other really nasty stuff he can do that's much less serious. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we haven't talked about is the ways in which Putin has restrained himself. Because he's so nasty, we don't like to say anything that sounds like it's nice about him. But I think we talked about this. People, out enjoying the spring sunshine in Kiev, last weekend. And in other cities. He could be bombing Kiev, with either missiles or with aircraft and bombs. He could be bombing Kiev. Mm-hmm. He could be bombing Lviv, where all those refugees are. Mm-hmm. He could be bombing cities all over Ukraine as a way of simply saying, I am going to do this until you stop fighting in the east. Mm-hmm. He has not done that. And one of the reasons why I'm not so worried about nuclear weapons is I don't think we'll get anywhere near nuclear weapons till we see some of that stuff. Mm-hmm.
And the reason why he hasn't done that is because of repercussions from the Western nations and everybody else. Like they would not take that lightly. They would increase the support of everything across the board to Russia's disadvantage if he escalated to that level, right?
Exactly. Well, and what are the Chinese going to say when Russia uses nuclear weapons? What is India going to say? Mm-hmm. Are they all still going to be on Russia's side? Mm-hmm. The idea that somehow using nuclear weapons is a low-cost thing for Russia to do, I just don't buy it. At the same time, if I were the Ukrainian leadership and the American leadership and everybody's leadership, I would recognize that there's a long way that this can get a lot uglier before we get anywhere near nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because we focus so much on nuclear weapons, we've deluded ourselves about some of the other nasty stuff that can happen that would be much lower cost reputationally to Putin, much less escalatory to Putin, but very damaging in Ukraine.
And that's probably the key, right? Very damaging in Ukraine, whereas probably the people in the rest of the world are also thinking about what's going to affect me at home, and that's nuclear weapons, right? And so...
which, by the way, and again, now I am going to sound like a warmonger, so forgive me. And I'm not trying to sound like a warmonger. I'm trying to basically say we got to play by the rules that Putin is setting. I would, if you're going to give, I would not promise anybody that their homeland is not going to get struck. Because if you can attack your neighbors without anybody, and everybody say, "Oh, you can attack your neighbors, but don't worry, we won't attack you back, and we won't let them attack you back." Well, why shouldn't you attack your neighbors? There's no cost.
You're referring specifically to comments by the administration that these weapons are not going to be used in Russia, on Russian territory.
Absolutely, and of course, weapons that the Ukrainians desperately need, we're not giving because they could be used to attack Russian territory.
Yeah. Which is interesting because Russia was the aggressor. Yeah.
Does anybody realize that this is a war? You know, this that I've got there's this great old New Yorker cartoon where the generals are all gathered around like the map table, and the one general says to the other, says, "Okay, all right, we'll have World War III, but remember, nobody gets hurt." And it's like we're still trying to fight this war without anybody getting hurt, and you know. I would love to see that, like just pillow fight or something.
Yeah, but that's not what reality is, and like you said, hard decisions and hard truths have to essentially you have to come to terms with some of those things, right? And the waters are being muddied by a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Moscow and Russia right now.
Yeah, and I guess my last sort of shot I would take is there's a lot of people who call themselves realists who seem to still have this hope that this war is going to be solved somewhere other than on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's like you could call yourself realist all you want, but that's delusional. That's idealistic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's naive. That's naive.
And what do they foresee happening exactly? Meaning, are you talking about economic collapse and stuff?
I think what they think is that if we just get the Ukrainians to make the right concessions, Putin will be satisfied. Mm-hmm. And he'll stop and declare victory and throw a parade. Mm-hmm.
Why could that not happen? Why would that not happen? If he took the Donbass and he could declare a victory, what is the argument against?
Well, he had a big chunk of the Donbass for 8 years. And that didn't satisfy him. Mm-hmm. He had Crimea for 8 years, still has Crimea. Didn't satisfy him. He took a whole bunch of territory. Hasn't satisfied him. He talks about Donbass, but what he's been seizing is the northern Black Sea coast. Right? Mm-hmm. They've controlled a part of Moldova since 1992. If this was about Donbass, why have they had troops in Moldova since 1992? Mm-hmm. I just think that it's not that it's impossible that could happen. I just think, why would you believe something for which there is so much contradictory evidence? Mm-hmm.
Have Russian capabilities.
May send me a birthday card next year, but why would I hope for that?
Well, one thought may be that Russian capabilities and maybe even their confidence has diminished greatly since this war started. So maybe they're setting their views. I mean, does he even still have the capabilities to exert his true ambitions anymore with everything that's happened over the past few months?
Well, I think this is a very good question, but the only way that those capabilities will be diminished is for the conflict to continue. And this is where, when Lloyd Austin said, and I don't think it's a very politic thing to say, we basically want to weaken the Russian army. What he's getting at is eventually there will be some kind of ceasefire. And when that happens, we want Russia to be degraded again enough so that it's not very easy for them to restart it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know anybody who thinks this is anywhere near that. So again, if we were paying attention to what happened in 2014, or what happened in Georgia, or what happened and what's gone on in Moldova for the last 20 years, we would not have too much reason to believe that Putin has some fixed idea of what he wants, and when he gets it, he's going to be fat and happy. Right? Well, the evidence we have is that he's going to keep pushing. And to be fair, in terms of trying to spread democracy, this is what the United States does, right?
Mm-hmm.
We try to spread democracy, which just happens to give us more allies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just don't see why you would expect someone to behave in such an odd way.
Well, so you raise the specter of this war being long and drawn out, and you make the argument that we should be prepared for that, and we should be prepared to support that. This war does have, global effects. You can even say second and third order effects beyond what's happening in Ukraine, Russia, and the West. From one of the articles I read, wheat supplies have been disrupted in African nations, which imported 44% of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine in the years immediately before the invasion. 45% increase in continental prices for the grain. So this could cause hunger in Africa. Who knows how many people could perish. So when we say this war could be long and drawn out, but it's having this global effect, how can we talk about this? Or how can we talk about,
I think there's two things. One is, again, this is something you and I talked about the second or third week of the war, right? This was something that was very predictable from the outset. What I think is really interesting about it is it's become more clear since then that if this is not necessarily an actual Russian strategy, it's certainly become part of their arsenal, which is as people begin to talk about the famine that's being caused by the Russian blockade of Ukrainian ports and Russian seizures of Ukrainian grain, the Russians are basically saying, well, the way to solve that is to get rid of the sanctions. Mm-hmm. And so Russia now is essentially holding hostage of the populations of a big chunk of Northern Africa to the sanctions. Mm-hmm. And, depending on one's point of view, you could say, wow, that's pretty cynical. That's more evidence that maybe Putin is not such a sweetheart that people think he is. Or maybe you say that's evidence that sanctions are bad and the United States and the West should remove the sanctions so that Putin could send wheat all over the world.
Yeah.
But clearly at this point, it's being used as a tactic by Russia.
Russia has the ability to alleviate this to some degree.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, to the extent that, wheat is not being planted because of the war, that's not an easy thing to alleviate while you're fighting the war. But in terms of the wheat and grain that's already harvested from last year's harvest that's sitting in Ukrainian warehouses and just waiting to go out of the port of Odessa, that could be solved very quickly if Russia wanted. Mm-hmm. But right now you can't even move a ship into that port because Russia's blockaded the port. Mm-hmm. So,
if this war drags on, does that something like that continue to happen? This blockade of the port where we're you say if, I will be stunned if it doesn't drag on. Mm-hmm. Yet there will be famine, and with famine will also go political violence. Mm-hmm. Nothing spurs revolution like hunger. Mm-hmm. So we'll see a new wave of instability and protest and violence around the world. Political destabilization, also specifically to African nations, which are already prone to destabilize governments already, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So it's going to escalate a lot of issues.
Even here in the United States, if you think about people who are sort of on the edge in terms of making ends meet, everything's gotten more expensive. Right? On the margin, a whole bunch of people who were on the poverty line last month are going to be below it this month. And a whole bunch of people who were just above it last month are going to be at it this month. Mm-hmm. So this matters to people who are on the edge.
Mm-hmm. And once again, it's being used as an argument to sow divisiveness amongst democracies in order to make us stop supporting Ukraine is also what's happening.
So there's this very interesting kind of battle, and this again is typical in warfare. It's the battle of who can sustain things on the battlefield longer, but there's this battlefield of who sort of population at large will support the war longer. Somebody said, this goes back 15 years ago or so, about the war in Afghanistan. Somebody, I wish I could remember who, it was an American general though, who said the strategic fulcrum of the Afghanistan war is American public opinion. Right? He said that what's going on in the battlefield in Afghanistan is important, but that's not what really is going to change things. What's going to change things is when the American people either get tired of this or are committed to sustaining it. And we know how that turned out.
I want to go back to that. I want to kind of end on this note, actually, because you brought up that you're coming off sounding like a warmonger, which is interesting because I think I was about to say, I think you objected to the invasion of Iraq. You could probably go back all the way to Vietnam. I think there was some dissent there as well.
Yeah, I just want to be clear. I wasn't old enough to
in retrospect, you were able to say.
I would have.
You would have been on the streets marching.
I will tell you, when we invaded Iraq in 1991, I went to a gigantic march in Washington, D.C. against that war.
Was that a just war in your thing? It wasn't a just war, the 1991 invasion?
Well, that reminds me of one of my favorite jokes. Was it a joke? And this was told to me by U.S. military. So, it's just war.
I mean, that happened because Iraq invaded Kuwait, right?
That happened because Iraq invaded Kuwait. And so my feeling at the time, and, I was just about to turn 26. It was a long time ago. But I don't necessarily fundamentally believe that I had it wrong, which was Kuwait was an authoritarian country, as authoritarian as any country on the planet, still is, no matter what anybody wants to say about it. And they got invaded by another authoritarian country, and it was really about oil. And we committed basically to going back in and booting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait and putting the Kuwaiti regime, with all of its medievalness, back in power. And no, I didn't support that.
Isn't there any similarities? I mean, this is also like Saddam Hussein has been was a major bad actor on the world stage, far more dangerous than the Kuwaiti regime, far more atrocities, even you could say, and he invaded a sovereign nation that probably threatened an American ally.
You could certainly. I mean, the case to be made was it was such a clear violation of borders, such a clear one sovereign country simply taking over another sovereign country. That was the case, and it was a reasonable case. I thought the most we were going to accomplish is make sure that Kuwait, instead of being run by a bad dictator, was being run by a good dictator, whatever that means. So I didn't think that was really the best thing to go to war over. Dick Cheney, who was defense secretary at the time, sort of said, "Well, really, it's about oil." And I didn't think that was going to worth. I thought back then we should be weaning ourselves off of oil. So I was against it.
Yeah, you're against it. And not only that, and then the second Iraq War was quite different reasoning, and I think we could both be on the same page there that no one thought, I think, we might have expressed it at the time, but it did not seem a smart idea, even though I think most of the population did go along with it at the time. But
hugely popular.
Yeah, it was a hugely popular war at the time.
But, I was against that one as well. And, and that one in a way was much worse. One of the things to defend what we did in 1991, there was a very clear United Nations resolution authorizing the United States and its allies to kick Iraq out of Kuwait, and that's really important. And the Soviet Union backed that resolution, abstained from it, I believe, if I remember correctly. So while I wasn't super keen on the war, it absolutely was done the right way.
This is the first Iraq War. The first war. Yeah, the first war.
The second one, you can have a debate about this, but just about anybody who does not work for the Bush administration is going to say, in the end, that was a violation of international law.
And retroactively, it's looking worse and worse and worse as time goes on, too.
Yeah. It was really this whole idea of regime change that we knew at the time, if we were paying attention, that the reasons to go to war there were ginned up and so on, which is not to say that Saddam Hussein wasn't a terrible person. It was just to say we did not have the right to do it. And And actually, I certainly didn't predict how badly it was going to turn out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I just thought that it was not a just war to fight.
And I think that's important to bring up because, like I said, we kind of have a different point of view for this conflict, right? As far as what is just action and what is not. And so it's really important to kind of go back and realize that there was a lot of instances where what the United States did was probably not right in light of history. But
right. And so a lot of people, I think, because they were against what we did there, they're against this as well.
Mm-hmm.
But what is it that was it Thoreau who said, "Foolishly held consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds"?
I love the quote. I'm not sure who said it.
I think it was Thoreau, one of those 19th century transcendentalists.
Yeah.
Might have been Emerson.
I'll have to look it up.
You'll have to look it up. But anyhow, those were bad wars. That doesn't mean this was bad war, right? Doesn't mean World War II was bad war, right? There were a lot of people, right? Nobody wants to remember this. There were a lot of Americans, right, who did not want to get involved in fighting against the Nazis. I think in retrospect, most people think, no, that was probably the right thing to do. The Nazis were not very good, and just leaving it to see what happened probably wasn't going to turn out well. And morally, it was probably not the right thing to do.
And at great risk, great sacrifice on the part of obviously the United States, and literally, if they joined that war later, the course of the war could have been very, very different as well, right? I mean, as far as Germany acquiring nuclear weapons, who knows what could have happened? But delayed action or slow action could have also changed the course of history.
Well, so we haven't talked too much about what's right and what's wrong here. But I do want to go back to an argument about right and wrong on Ukraine that we haven't really probably heard enough about, which is after the Soviet Union collapsed, there were about 1,500 nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory. And the West, the United States in particular, and Russia joined together to put a major economic squeeze on Ukraine to get rid of those weapons, to give those weapons away. And Ukraine did that. And that everybody thought, right, Ukraine has to get rid of those weapons because we don't want another nuclear power in the world. That would make the world a lot less safe. So Ukraine gave away those nuclear weapons to make the world a safer place. Russia promised not to invade. And now, of course, Russia has invaded. And so if you're the United States and the UK, who actually sort of made these very vague assurances to Ukraine at that time, do you have a moral obligation? I don't know. I mean, actually, I of course, I have an opinion. But I think this is one of the other things that we haven't thought about is Ukraine gave away its nuclear weapons. Maybe we should save this for another time. And it's getting clobbered. What does that do for the next 10 countries the United States wants to say to, oh, you shouldn't get nuclear weapons, right?
Who's going to believe? Who's going to believe that? Yeah.
And I'm going to list some of the countries that could easily get nuclear weapons because they have the technology and the economy. Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, Ukraine eventually, depending on, might be able to do it. If the big powers of the world are not going to protect the non-nuclear powers, well, then only a crazy country would remain a non-nuclear power.
And just to be clear, if Ukraine kept those nuclear weapons, that would have acted as a deterrent to this war. This war would not have happened if Ukraine had those weapons still.
Well, I think that's a pretty safe guess. Now, there's an argument to be made that if Ukraine had kept those nuclear weapons, Russia would have invaded in 1993, and the United States would have blessed that invasion.
Oh, wow!
As a way of taking control of those nuclear weapons before the Ukrainians were able to make them operational. We really don't know. I mean, it's hard to run alternative history. I actually, and I've written a lot about this, and I've talked to people who are deeply involved in the negotiations. I don't think Ukraine had any cards to play in that situation. I think ultimately the mistake that was made was not Ukraine giving away its nuclear weapons, but Ukraine then not spending the next 20 years as fast as they could getting ready to fight a war with Russia. That's my 2 cents.
Well, some very, very important things. I'm really glad we talked about, what is right and what is wrong. And I think there's some very tough decisions that need to be made. And none of those choices are easy. And I certainly gained a lot of clarity on some things, I think, having this conversation. I hope our listeners did as well. So
I'm guessing the comments box will fill up this week with some of the stuff.
We'll see. It's nice. I mean, even if people disagree, it's always great to hear the feedback and everything else. That's what we want, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I want to say, I know that I sound pretty strident about some of this stuff, but I'll just say this on the record, right? Reasonable people can disagree about these things.
Yeah.
These are really tough questions. And, the thing I appreciate about the questions you ask is it really allows us to surface these debates and hopefully acknowledge that these are really tough questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, Paul. That was great. Once again, we will do this every weekend. So join us again next weekend, and I'll talk to you next weekend, Paul.
Sounds good.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.